For the bulk of the semester, we're going to be taking a look at the history and the development of the U.S. welfare state. Now, the kind of reading that you've done for this week and will be doing for the rest of the semester may wind up being a little difficult for many of you. I suspect that few of you have backgrounds as history majors, so this kind of material can sometimes seem like this incomprehensible, endless list of arbitrary events and dates, right? As someone once complained about the history profession, it's just one damn thing after another. So, to help make sense of this, why don't we start with some patterns, some ways to think about moments in time so we can start to build an architecture to think about the development of things. So, what you're looking at here shows a pretty typical chronological way of breaking down periods, not just of social welfare history, but of US history more generally. And as you can see, it tends to turn on large scale events: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, industrialization, the Great Depression, and so on. So this is a simpler way of thinking about where we've been in terms of national social welfare policy. Up until 1934, which is where we're going to be focusing our attention this semester, the federal government or the national government, those tend to mean the same thing, they did very little. It built roads and bridges and canals, it ran the post office, it operated a federal court system, it coined money, it waged war and conducted foreign affairs. Most of what it did domestically was to facilitate commerce. Hence, this is what Mettler and Milstein call the era of promotional governments, a time of very limited national policy, most of which was designed to help the economy function. The 1930s ushered in a radical break, and you'll see that next semester, beginning what they call a period of redistributive governance, when national policy intervenes much more in the economy in order to regulate commerce and to improve overall well-being. This is in part because the Great Depression itself offered evidence that a limited government and unregulated economy was prone to crisis. Now, our current period they describe as one of heterogeneous governance, in which your experience of the national government depends on who you are. As government does more and more to assist upper income Americans, while it scales back its post-World War II era redistributive support for working class, low income, and poor people. But this focus on national level policies and programs, which is what a lot of social welfare history does, obscures the reality that we will be exploring. That there was a lot that states and localities were doing both to help and to harm people prior to the New Deal. So, focusing more narrowly on social welfare policy, if someone were to ask you what the pattern of policy development has been over time, you could say simply from local to national, or from small to large, or from very limited to fairly expansive. That is, if you found yourself in need in the colonial era, you wouldn't have a lot of options. Mostly you relied upon your family and your neighbors. That was the welfare state, meaning there was none for the most part for a lot of people in a lot of places. And if they couldn't find help, if your family couldn't help, if your friends couldn't help, and they were likely as poor as you were kind of out of luck. As we move later into the colonial era, if you lived in a big city, there may have been a poorhouse you could go to for food and shelter. But most were terrible and a grim last resort. And even that wasn't often an option in smaller cities and towns. Now, as the population started to grow and need became more apparent and more pressing, counties started to build poorhouses to deal with poor people from many smaller cities. You might also, in the 18th or early 19th centuries, that is the 17 and 1800s, have been able to get a bit of outdoor relief. Food, fuel, or rarely cash to help you get by. Now, as we move forward in time, higher levels of government begin to get into the relief business. Families were all that was available in most places until the 18th century. Then more and more cities offered aid of one kind or another, and then states started to get involved a bit. Still mostly with institutions of indoor relief like the poorhouses and workhouses where you had to check in to get help. This changed most dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That's the late 1900s and early 2000s, right? Or late 1800s and late 1900s and early 2000s. See, even I get confused. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the progressive era, when finally states really started to get involved in a broad range of programs of insurance, assistance, and regulation. Then finally, the federal government starts to get involved in the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. Local, county, state, national. That's the progression, with the biggest transformations taking place in the progressive era and the New Deal. Now, there's a key difference between the US and other welfare states. What in other countries would typically be done by government is often done in the US by nonprofit, voluntary, charitable, civic organizations. We rely much more heavily on the so-called private sector or civic sector for service delivery. But here's an important corollary. Even if we do depend more upon the private sector to deliver human services, most of those services are still funded by the public sector. And you know this for those of you who have experience in the not-for-profit human service agencies, right? Most of whom are likely to have a contract with the city or the state or the federal government, maybe even all three. It's also useful, by the way, to keep in mind that in this context, that when people talk about the size of the charitable or philanthropic sector in the US, a relatively small portion is actually dedicated to the needs of people you are likely to be working with and for. Lots of charitable giving is to the symphony or the opera or people's universities. Worthy enough endeavors, but not relevant for our purposes, and not necessarily helpful when included in data people use to talk about how supposedly generous Americans are. Put simply, as it was here by Thomas Paine, one of the writers who helped to kickstart the American Revolution, collective action through government can do things that atomized individuals acting alone simply cannot do, which we should keep in mind. This might be a good place to pause and to read here what Paine wrote. Here's another important point to keep in mind as we think about the history of the US welfare state. Whatever the story we are telling, whatever the overall patterns, not all groups benefited equally from whatever policy innovation we may be discussing. The African American and Native American experiences are especially key here. Whatever the shape of the narrative of how social policy has changed over time, which is often a story focused on European immigrants in northern cities, there's almost always an entirely separate story to be told about the Black experience and a separate story to be told about the Native experience. Likewise, women's experience has always been distinct, starting with the fact that they have always been disproportionately poor. I emphasize this because you will hear people talking about the post-1970s feminization of poverty. Now that's true, as you'll discover later on, so far as it goes. The growing poverty of women with children is an important and sad recent story, but it's not really new. Not just in US history, but in world history, women have always been poorer. Largely because of limited access to the labor market and other kinds of discrimination, and the expectation that they will bear the burden of caring for children and sick relatives. We'll return to this dilemma over and over again, since it's a key challenge of social welfare policy and poverty. Here's another constant. US relief programs have always been distinguishing between the so-called worthy and the unworthy, or between the deserving and the undeserving. The work test functions this way. It's a way to make certain that people who seek help are actually trying to find work and not just looking for a shortcut. So in extreme form, we can think of the work tests in local urban poorhouses of the 19th century, in which residents would have to literally carry stones from one side of the yard and then back again to demonstrate that they were willing to work before they could get food or shelter. But even in the so-called job training programs under TANF, that's Temporary Assistance to Needy Families today, there's plenty of busy work that doesn't really improve skills or entail productive labor, but is in effect just a morality test. And women who are unwilling to subject themselves to what they perceive to be a waste of time, often rightly so, or are unwilling to be disrespected in such ways, are almost by definition then deemed unworthy. So the final pattern that I want to point out for now is that because of our federal system in which power is shared between the national and state governments, and you'll read about this shortly in the next couple of weeks, there can be lots and lots of variation in the kinds of assistance that are available from place to place, including benefit amounts, program rules and regulations, and more. So again, if we take the current cash welfare program TANF, that's a really good example of this. Not only do welfare programs vary a lot from state to state, but they even vary within states and they vary within counties, which can have different rules and priorities. And within counties, cities can run different programs. And even within cities, the kinds of help available to you can vary from welfare office to welfare office, and sometimes even in the same office from caseworker to caseworker. This is another way we see a theme I have emphasized a lot already, the sheer complexity of the social welfare policy system in the US. Now, it's easy to tell the story of policy change through biography, and people often do. So often the progressive era becomes a story about Jane Addams, and the New Deal becomes a story about President Roosevelt. Now, they were important actors, make no mistake. But think about the scale of change that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the broad range of child saving, municipal reform, and labor reforms, you'll be reading about all of those, that happened. Surely there have to be larger forces at work than just individual actors, right? Large-scale change requires large-scale forces, which means it's almost never really a story of individual action. It's collective action that is often at the heart of the explanation, and we'll return to that. So we're going to talk a lot about change over time, and there really has been lots of it, but not everything has changed as much as some people think, as this shows the average time people spend on relief, how often they move from relief programs to work, the value of that relief benefit, and the percentage of the population living in what today we call homeless shelters has been relatively constant since at least the early 1800s. This is worth thinking about, and again, we'll return to these kinds of questions. So here it is all in one place, right? Patterns, family to city to county to state to federal, maybe back again, we'll talk about that next semester. Private versus public, right? Knowing that even private charity uses public money. Not all people benefit equally. Women have been disproportionately poorer. There's almost always a means test. There's almost always a morality test, almost work requirements tied into that, right? Not always a story just of leaders, but often of people gathering together in groups and forcing the government to do things it doesn't want to do. And there's lots and lots of variation from place to place. And these hold constant throughout most of our history. So finally here, talking about these constants of relief, I just want to quickly draw your attention to patterns that we can see, not just in the US, but across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years if we look at mostly Western European history. And again, this is a place maybe you want to pause and take a look at what's going on here. And we can return to this or pull this up in class if you want to spend a few minutes talking about it.